I think we'll get started. We can possibly then have some questions and answers at the end. Welcome. My name is Scott Miller. I'm Dean of the College of Humanities, and this is an annual event that our college is very proud of hosting, the James L. Barker Lecture. This is named after James Barker, who was a professor of languages here at BYU back in the mid-century, 20th century. We are fortunate today to have some of his descendants and family with us, and I would like to invite them to stand for a moment and be welcomed by the audience. Professor Dean, who will receive a much better introduction in a moment, also has family members in attendance, and I would like to invite them to stand so that we can greet them as well and welcome them to this lecture. So with all of the Dean family visitors. Now, this lecture commemorates Professor Dean being named the James L. Barker Lecturer for 2018-2019. So before she can even say a word, she has to be lecturerized. So I'm going to do that now. I have the plaque here, so Professor Dean, would you come up here, and I will present this to you officially. We'll begin today with Professor Chris Crow, a colleague of Professor Dean, will give the invocation. Following that, Professor Dewan Coombs will give an introduction, and then we'll finish it.
Our Heavenly Father, we're grateful this morning to be gathered together as colleagues and friends and family members to be instructed and inspired by Debbie's lecture. We're grateful for her expertise, for her knowledge and understanding of the scholar. We're grateful, Father, too, for the donors who made this lecture possible, who made this venue possible. We're thankful for the many blessings we have here at BYU for our students and colleagues. We pray that Thou would bless each of us as an audience member, that we might get the most out of this lecture. And we pray, too, Thou would bless Debbie as she speaks, that she can feel a sense of peace and comfort as she delivers what she's prepared. Again, we thank Thee, Lord, for the many blessings that we receive from Thy hand. We pray for those who have less, and we pray that we might be inspired to know how to help others. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen.
So it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Deborah Dean, this year's recipient of the James Barker Lectureship. As a professor of English, she currently serves as the director of the English teaching program, where she teaches courses in and conducts research in writing pedagogy. She's the author of 6 books, including Genre Theory, Teaching, Writing, and Being, and the author of numerous research articles. She also works as a consultant for the National Council of Teachers of English, and she's the director of the Central Utah Writing Project. Dr. Dean has received numerous awards for her scholarship and for her teaching and for her citizenship to the college and the university. And she served as the associate chair of the English department as well as the assistant dean of undergraduate education. Whether earning her master's and doctorate degrees while simultaneously teaching high school and raising her 6 children, or balancing the demands of academia, church service, and family, Dr. Dean approaches life the way she approaches writing, strategically and purposefully. Beyond her academic and scholarly accolades, she's known to her among her colleagues and her associates for her gracious, humble, and thoughtful nature. And to junior faculty, she's a generous mentor. To her students, a motivating teacher. And to her husband and 23 grandchildren, a devoted supporter and superb baker of cookies. We are excited to learn from her today.
Like my cookies, but I thought, oh no, where did my talk go? So anyway, I'm happy to be here. I had just begun work on my doctorate when I saw an advertisement in a professional journal posted from BYU for the position that I now have. I hadn't really thought about teaching at a university. My timing for beginning the doctorate was much more pragmatic. I didn't want to ever take the GRE again. And if I wanted to pursue more education, which I did, I needed to get into a program before my scores expired. So the advertisement was a surprise. It raised a possibility for me that I had not even considered before. Even though I was early in my program, my husband encouraged me to contact BYU, which I did. A few days later, our phone rang in the kitchen while I was sweeping the floor. It was someone from BYU. The voice on the other end asked me some questions and then asked me to send a vita. I said I would, and I hung up. Now the problem was this. I didn't know what a vita was. I was a high school English teacher who had earned my master's and was currently earning my doctorate in evenings, weekends, and summers while I taught full-time. I didn't hang out at the university with my professors. I did not know the genres of the academy. So I wasn't sure what this BYU person wanted. I knew some Latin though, and in Latin, some of you can already tell where this is going to go, vita meant life. So I figured he wanted my life story. So I knew enough about audience to consider that they would probably want to know more about my professional life than my personal one, but I still sent something that started like this. I was born in Anchorage, Alaska, and that is where I grew up, married, and had my family before returning to BYU to finish my teaching degree. After I had finished, we moved to Washington State, where I began teaching junior high and high school. I can't remember, I think it was about 2 pages of this kind of prose. I sent it off through the email, and a few days later, I received a reply that said, "This is a very non-traditional vita." I've never forgotten that as a writing teacher. Would you like to see a more traditional one? I said I would, and he sent something that looked like this. What I would have called a resume in my life to that point. Although there are differences between a vita and a resume, they are what I would call sibling genres. They have similarities. Now, I was really lucky to have a kind reader who, it turns out, had had a background similar to mine, one that didn't initiate him into the genres of the academy either. I can imagine some other readers at the university that would have taken one look at that first attempt and thought, what an idiot, what planet is this woman from? That would have been the end of that path, and I would not be here today. I tell this story as an example of how we all bump into genres through our lives in more or less successful ways. Sometimes our understanding of those genres is something we take for granted. We know how to interact in a particular situation without even thinking about it. Sometimes the situation is kind of new and we can kind of approximate, get close enough to the genres that we need that we can at least not get laughed out of the situation for our misunderstandings. And sometimes our lack of success isn't responded to as generously as mine was. I've heard stories of people not being accepted to grad school, not getting a job, of not getting the desired response or refund, for example, because they didn't know the accepted genres of the different situations. They didn't know the nuances that signal insider status, what their readers and other users of the genre expect. A lot of times we think of genres as categorizing tools. We look at something and we say, oh, it's a letter, it's a fairy tale, it's an advertisement. We label from the final written product, when actually, genres actually work from the other side. They are from their origin rather than from their inform. Genres are the texts, both written and oral, that people in a situation develop to do their work in that space. And in every situation, people in that situation develop the text that they find acceptable to use, including the forms and the language, the ways people talk to each other, and how they're expected to use text to interact. These texts often develop visible surface features and similarities that we can use to label them after the fact that they're developed. But it's important to remember that it's not the form that makes the genre, it's really the action that results from the form that is the genre and is at the heart genre. Because each genre is unique to its situation, insiders often are unaware of how they have been initiated into the genres and the ways that the genre positions users. My first vita looked a lot like the vita my colleague sent me, but in some subtle ways, it wasn't exactly the same. And that's okay, because beginners, newcomers to a situation, learn to approximate genres. So here's an example. This is our grandson, Matthew, and he wanted to show his mother that he can make a treat for himself. He approximates the genre of a recipe. Writing a list on a card, he notes the ingredients like peanut butter and chocolate, and tools such as a knife. I asked him about why he put his name on it, and he said he wanted his mom to know that he had written it. Now, I thought about that, and I thought a person's name isn't usually a part of a genre, but I have recipes, Leslie's Baked Beans and Lindsay's Stroganoff, that do have a name on them, so sometimes we see names on the recipes too. Matthew doesn't list all of the amounts, although he notes a tablespoon of water, nor does he explain the process, but he has some aspects of the genre, and that's what approximating a genre is all about, getting some of the characteristics right, even though we might be missing some others. It's a recognizable attempt at doing the job of the genre. One of our granddaughters was making a book. Because she was surrounded by books and had parents who read to her, she knew a book consisted of pages held together with words and pictures on each page. So when she had the container, that is, the papers stapled together, she wrote a title page and then something on each page from what she knew, we assume. I'll read the content here in a second. Her book, All About Love, is an approximation of a genre she knew. We aren't exactly sure where all this content comes from, though. Okay, love is important. Also, grown-ups love each other. They use it for marriage. Your mom and dad use it for having a baby. Grandpas and grandmas love each other, and their babies love each other. Love is created by marriage. You can see that Shannon is learning about a genre, informational books, and she is still dealing with things like page boundaries and developing content. But she is approximating a genre she has had interactions with. Another granddaughter presented her parents with a friend article she had written and wanted to share at a family home evening. Friend articles have specific characteristics developed for that magazine for LDS children, both to entertain and to teach. You can see that Lauren has figured out many of the physical characteristics of the genre, the title, the author, even that blurb in the corner, and a little illustration. If we had time to read the whole thing, you'd see that the article tells a story about a boy who learns a lesson. So Lauren had also recognized the idea that readers are supposed to learn something from the articles and the stories in the Friend magazine. This is a good attempt at approximating a genre. The story is pretty fast through the narrative arc, but we loved reading it. And as a writing teacher, I loved reading some of the sentences that show the piling on of troubles before the boy finally changes his attitude. It's obvious that even at age 8, Lauren was beginning to become familiar with the nature of friend articles as a genre because of her exposure, and she was doing pretty well at it. One of our grandsons, Gabe, was in first grade when he went to the science fair in his school and was fascinated by the projects on display. When he came home that night, he taped 2 pieces of paper together to imitate the trifold posters he'd seen. On one side, he made a diagram, and on the other side, he wrote his text. How does a ball roll? A ball has a body. Like us, the body is round. Like the whole thing, the body is a circle. Now, he's labeled his illustrations, the word body with a line pointing to the circle, and the title, How a Ball Rolls, with a line pointing to the diagram of a ball in motion. There are many ways that Gabe's science report approximates science fair reports created by more advanced writers and learners. He knew about the physical shape. He knew that he needed both diagrams and text. He knew that he needed a title that was a question that would be explained in the display. He even somehow understood that science is often explained through similes and metaphors. At his young age and with his limited exposure, Gabe did not understand some of the other nuances of the genre, the need to show the results of experimentation, for example, although he might have been trying to do that with his diagram. He didn't understand completely the type of questions that best support a science project report or some aspects of science exploration, such as hypotheses and materials lists and data and variables and so forth. His limited exposure, however, allowed him to begin to approximate the genre even without any instruction, simply from observing several examples and being interested enough to begin to notice the genre's obvious features. Now, I've been giving examples of children approximating the genres that they interact with in their worlds, and there's some more of them there. We look at their approximations, and I think Most of us find them charming. But children aren't the only ones who sometimes need to approximate genres. Students are often asked to write genres from communities that they are not a part of, and whose genres they may not have read very much. Literary analysis essays, for example, or scientific lab reports. Teachers expect students in their classes to do the scholarly types of writing that is done in their discipline, and students valiantly attempt to do just that, usually more or less successfully. All of us, at one time or another, are asked to write in a genre for a community where we might be an outsider. We too approximate genres, and we hope for as generous readers as we are with my grandchildren's writing. Recently, I was in a novice position again with a digital genre. I have been enjoying memes about teaching on social media. They were clever and pithy, and as a consumer, I had laughed at many and been puzzled by others. I thought I had begun to grasp the nature of the relationship between the image and the words, and I thought I'd try to write one. I'm going to only show up for a short time because it's so bad. I thought I'd ask my students to do it, so I thought I'll try this first. I even looked, after I'd read lots of them, I looked online to see if there was any advice for writing them. The right advice wasn't very helpful. So here's mine. Mine's okay, but it's not quite there yet. I'm obviously still a beginner with this genre. So I'm skipping that since it's so bad. So the thing about genre acquisition, as opposed to approximation, is that real acquisition usually requires at least two things. First, some time spent in the situation or the group that uses the genre, and then attention to the genres and how they do their work. And that attention can be conscious or unconscious. We need to experience the ways that genres situate the users in a community. And often we acquire genres so gradually that we're unaware of how we have been situated and how we've learned to write and talk in those different groups or situations. We're so familiar with the way people act and interact in those situations, we just do it too. And it's similar in some ways to the ways we use language in the church. We often use words like ward and stake, and without thinking about how those uses signal us as insiders with insider status. That being said, even as part of a group, sometimes we might not pay close attention to the genres we use or how they work. This is a stock photo, not the girl I'm talking about. Once a youth speaker in our ward began her talk like most youth speaker talks, with a definition from the dictionary about the term she'd been asked to speak on. We recognize that, don't we? About 5 minutes into her talk, however, it was clear that no matter how many sacrament meetings she had sat through, she was not totally familiar with the genre of a youth speaker talk in sacrament meeting. She began telling stories about school and her friends. And about 20 minutes in, she was pretty much repeating conversations that she would with her friends. And she was like, no way. And I was like, and she noted that her mother was signaling for her to stop, but she didn't. So comfortable that she even started using words that those of us familiar with junior high hallways would recognize, but words that don't usually get spoken in church, let alone over the pulpit. At 25 minutes, the bishop stood up, put his arm around her shoulder, and prompted her to finish. Despite a number of years in church, this young woman had clearly not fully acquired the characteristics of the genre she was using. Now, we've all probably had experiences where we've been sitting in sacrament meetings where something about the speaker makes us uncomfortable because we recognize, whether we recognize it consciously or not, that they have an unfamiliarity with the ways we tacitly agree are the ways we use language and the things we talk about in that situation. Usually, when we can see that just existing in a space doesn't always get us all the way to genre acquisition. Usually, when we need to use a new genre, our first step in acquiring it is to default to a genre we already know. And that might be something similar. That was with my Vita. When the United States was new, George Washington needed to give a State of the Union address. No one had ever done it before. There was no genre for that situation. And so it was, what did he have to do? He had to go back to an antecedent genre, the one you build from, and his closest one was the King's Speech to Parliament, a totally different situation, but the closest one he could find. So he adapted from the genre he knew to establish the foundation of a new genre, one that continues to develop today. And we do the same thing. If we don't know a genre, we borrow one that we do know, that we hope is close, and that's how we start acquisition. Now, we often, when we are borrowing, we carry with us characteristics from the genres that we already know. So this is another granddaughter, and you heard from DeJuan's introduction, I have a lot of them that I really love. She was recently texting me about a school fundraiser. On Sundays, their family writes letters on paper and sends them to us through the mail. She knows the letter genre well from her experience with them. And here we can see Bailey using a new genre, text messages, and bringing in characteristics of a genre she knows. If you notice at the end, she has the salutation and her name that you see typical of a letter, but not typical of a text message. So I have to admit, for me, I think it's cute, nice, I can see what's happening here. But I, as a person who uses text all the time, have not fully embraced all the conventions of texting. I still use mostly correct sentence structure and punctuation, and I'm ashamed to say I can't use abbreviations. I sometimes include an emoji. In fact, with some of my granddaughters, our texts are entirely emojis. They don't write yet. But I can't get myself to use you, the letter U, for the word you. So even though I'm experienced, I have not fully embraced all of the characteristics of this genre. But I think that since genres are social, that means that the people that I text with probably know me and will accept that limitation. Genres are also social in the ways they situate users of the genre, sometimes without us even being aware. So my students were studying the genre of wedding announcements, and I think some of you were even in this class that might have been looking at some of these. I wanted them to notice that genres change over time when the users decide to make those changes. And as I showed them a series of announcements, they noticed physical changes, beginning with this more traditional wedding announcement with white embossed cardstock with a fancy font, to more recently, the use of color and less formal fonts. My students found the study very interesting. Of course, this was a genre that they would all be using soon or had recently used. What they failed to note, however, even though it might have been important to them as users, was the way the language situated the users, and often didn't change when the more obvious physical features of the genre did change. You can see the language of the wedding announcement is worded very similarly to, I'm sorry to say, a deed of transfer. Parents have a daughter being transferred to a son of parents. It was of interest to me that the users seemed unaware, as they modernized the visual aspects of the genre, that they kept the traditional language. One of our friends was hurt when the bride's family left her husband's name off. They were the groom's parents, off the announcement. And it was interesting to me to consider why. Because the groom's family doesn't usually play a large role. So it was the tradition, the expectation that they would be named in it. I was thinking if the groom's family do play a larger role, maybe they should be foregrounded, their name should be somewhere different. If it's, this is just something that doesn't change. But we are beginning to see shifts in that too. My son, whose announcement is on your left, who was older, at least for our LDS culture, when he married, called to ask us if we would be okay with this language on his announcement that put him and his bride as the center. The only suggestion we made is he said it was originally Brandy Nelson and Michael David Dean are happy to announce, and I asked them to change it to ecstatic, and they did. We're named at the bottom of the announcement, probably for the benefit of our friends who might want to place who is sending the announcement, but not in any important way. And as you can see, another departure in this announcement is the one on the side, which is for our son-in-law's sister. And I just love the line at the bottom where it does mention the parents of the bride and groom hosting a reception as soon as they've been resuscitated. And so we can see that there is some change, not merely the formal tone from earlier announcements. And in this extreme example, we can see when users are actually aware of the social nature of the genre and the way it situates its users as they change the text and format to do what they want, rather than keeping the format and language when it doesn't fit them. We actually learned a lot about the couple and their interests, and there were 6 of these movie posters. But it was a little challenging to find the information for the wedding and the reception. Genres are also situated in specific places. That is, we come to expect certain genres in certain places. And when we come back to our car after we've been in the grocery store and we see a piece of paper under the windshield wiper, we can immediately limit the possibilities of what it might be to only one of a few genres. It won't be our tickets to the play next Saturday. It probably won't even be a parking ticket, what we might expect if our car were parked somewhere else, because most shopping lots don't have rules that would incur tickets. It might be a flyer for a weight loss product or some other product service we might or not use. And it might be a note left from someone who bumped our car if you were unlucky enough to be bumped and lucky enough to have a responsible person who did it. There just aren't very many other things that it could be. And when we think about it, many of the genres we use are likewise situated. We are in a place, we are handed a piece of paper, and we pretty much know a limited range of what it will be. We know that if we walk to the ticket window at the theater, they want to see our tickets, not the recent paper we sent to a journal. A clerk in the store hands us a receipt, not a diploma. On the other hand, in April, when we're dressed in our gowns, we expect the dean to hand us a diploma. Kind of like a receipt, really, but genres are the currency of each situation. Because genres develop in situations for the needs of users, they have regularities that we come to expect. We expect a receipt to have the amount we spent, the date, the name of the store where we bought the product. Sometimes we might see a request to complete a survey. We never see a list of ingredients that we might find on a product we purchased. Our common expectations, however, don't limit individual adaptations. Sometimes the server will sign the receipt or put a handwritten thank you on it. Sometimes the receipt has the logo of the company. Genres are expected aspects, but they also have flexible ones. I think of genres a little like a balloon. It can be inflated or deflated. It can even be twisted into shapes. But if you try to put too much air in or twist it beyond its capacity, it pops. This aspect of flexibility allows users to individualize aspects of genres, and different genres have different ranges of flexibility. So business and government genres tend to be the least flexible, and creative genres tend to be the most. Still, we have to consider when something goes too far, and I'm going to explain with this example. This is a Paper Bag Princess, is a children's book, and from the cover, we could assume that it's a fairy tale with all the attendant characteristics of the genre. A prince and a princess, a dragon, a castle, magic, and a happily ever after. The story follows those expectations somewhat. A dragon attacks a castle, burns everything, and carries away the prince. The princess, wearing only a paper bag, as all her clothes were burned with his fire, goes after him. And when she meets the dragon, she shows persistence in not allowing him to put her off, and she shows ingenuity in outwitting him, using his pride against him by encouraging him and praising him for his fire and his speed until he has shown off so much that he is exhausted and falls into a deep sleep. The princess walks past the sleeping dragon to save the prince. Now, to this point, we see some genre stretching. We see the role reversal. The princess is saving the prince. And we see the use of brains over brawn in the saving. But here's where the book really veers from expectation. Last 2 pages. Elizabeth walked right over the dragon and opened the door to the cave. There was Prince Ronald. He looked at her and said, "Elizabeth, you are a mess. You smell like ashes, your hair is all tangled, and you are wearing a dirty old paper bag. Come back when you are dressed like a real princess." "Ronald," said Elizabeth, "your clothes are really pretty and your hair is very neat. You look like a real prince, but you are a bum. They didn't get married after all." Now the question is this still a fairy tale or not? Did it have so many stretches that it popped the balloon? My students always have differing opinions, and this is a question users acquiring and adapting a genre might need to consider. A number of years ago, Oprah selected a memoir, A Million Little Pieces, for her Book of the Month Club, instantly creating a bestseller. It turned out that the memoir was not exactly or entirely accurate. The writer had not had the experiences he reported having. In his defense, he argued that some people had had those experiences and that he was trying to raise awareness by sharing them in his memoir, but that didn't matter. Readers expect a little stretching in a memoir. After a while, when you're writing about yourself, you always make yourself look a little bit better. But they don't expect to have whole experiences made up and still be labeled a memoir. The stretching was too far. And the publisher had to publish an addendum to explain the ways this book wasn't what people expected. They had to republish it as a different genre. The whole thing was a huge scandal, and it was all over genre boundaries, what we expect and what we get. Once we've acquired genres, when we know how to use them well, we can often appropriate them for our own uses outside the usual situations where we normally find them. And this is a careful line because we have to know that the readers will know that's what we're doing, and they have to be okay with it. Let me give an example, and the first one is a negative one. A couple of years ago, I picked up the mail as I got home from work, and as I thumbed through it, I saw an envelope with my name and address handwritten on it. I didn't recognize the returned address, but I thought it must be from a friend who might have moved or whose address I might have forgotten. Who else would handwrite my name and address and a return address on an envelope? I put all the other mail down and excitedly opened the envelope, only to find a flyer for a car auction. I was not only disappointed, I was angry. I recognized that the sender had anticipated my response to the situation and genre exactly. That person knew that a computer-generated label would have meant that the envelope would have gone straight to the garbage. The handwritten envelope, however, put me in an entirely new space with its attendant expectations. I was so angry at being manipulated that way that I still feel a little residual anger today. But the experience made me aware of how people use our expectations of genres for their own purposes, sometimes without our awareness. And if you watch, advertisers do it all the time. A more responsible appropriation of genre is shown in this popular picture book, Dragonology. We're all aware of science books and encyclopedias and the genres they use to represent truth and facts, charts and graphs, diagrams and maps. In this book about dragons, the author uses these, what I call truthy genres, to present information about dragons as though they were also real and true and scientific. The appropriation works here because we're all aware of both sides, that dragons are not real and that these genres lend reality to a romantic idea we have carried with us since childhood. What if they were? A former student of mine who went on to grad school sent me a Christmas letter, an interesting genre in its own right that has had lots of commentary about it, and how it positions its users forced to read the glowing accomplishments of relatives that have been written in over-the-top language. This student and her husband, immersed in graduate school and academics, had had a baby. They appropriated a scholarly article to share the changes in their lives that a baby had created. As a reader, I was under no illusion that I was reading an actual scholarly article, but I could enjoy the way these creative scholars appropriated the genre they knew for their own purposes. I didn't feel manipulated. I was entertained and pleased. That's the key to appropriation. We can use genres for different purposes when we understand the nuances of the genre well enough, and when we do so for creative purposes rather than manipulative ones. So what does this mean for us? After all, most of us go through our lives bumping into genres of all types, and many of us or most of us may not be aware of how those genres are situating us or how our use of them might help us be more or less successful in our interactions. And most of us make our way through our lives just fine. I guess I hope that a heightened awareness of genre will do two things. First, I hope it makes us more accepting of novice attempts to enter our worlds. I will say Chris Crone was the person who was the nice person at the other end of my first attempt at Avita. So I hope it makes us a little bit more like Chris, a little bit more willing to be the nice recipient of someone who might be seeing our writing as non-traditional rather than as wrong, and as a beginner rather than an outsider, as someone who is trying to enter a situation. I hope it makes us nicer that way. And second, I hope that a heightened awareness will help us make our way through the world a little less bruised by the genres we bump into and the ones that bump into us and bump us back and maybe bruise us. So that would be a very good thing. Thank you.
what happens when there are genres that acquire conventional features that that irritate us or that we push in there? For example, when resumes kind of become too fancy or elaborate or long, or sacrament meeting talks always start with a joke or
Sometimes it depends on your position in the group, okay? So if you are in a company, let's say, and you're the one who makes the decisions based on resumes, eventually if you're turning down resumes that have those features they're like decorative or, whatever, and you find that less professional, then certainly eventually the people who get hired, you start to create more of a climate that this is the kind of thing that's accepted. But that's because you're in a position where you can make that change. Now, if you're just a person who's listening to a sacrament meeting talk, you can't change very much about what happens in sacrament meeting talks unless you're the prophet who can kind of say some things. But most of us just have to be a good example and then endure the other examples that are around us. And I guess that's just part of living in a group and kind of making those tacit agreements. And sometimes you can notice, for instance, visiting of one ward and another ward, and you see those subtle differences. It's like that. There are things that we all know are kind of acceptable at church, but each little ward and each little group makes its own kind of, this is more acceptable than other places. So when we were visiting our daughter in Houston, they had lots and lots of converts who brought elements of their previous religious beliefs with them to church. So it was not at all like a sacrament meeting that you would find here, for instance. And there was a lot of praise the Lord as part of their talks. But that was because they were bringing in, and their culture had accepted that as appropriate because there were so many people. So each group kind of sets what it will tolerate within the bounds. Does that make sense? If you have power, you have more ability to change it. If you don't have much power, you just endure. So that's the way it goes. Sorry. Any other questions? Yes?
How did you approach preparing this presentation for the genre of the Barker?
That was hard, actually. One of the things I did was ask for a list of all of the previous titles so that I could see what had been talked about before, the nature of the titles. And so I wrote a title that I thought fit the nature of the other titles. And then thought about the context and the situation, thought about who would be in attendance. So there are a whole bunch of features, but I did start by looking first at what had been done and said in the past, and then trying to fit what I do within that framework, and hoping that I wasn't popping the balloon. I was just maybe stretching
Still
it.
inflated.
Okay, good. I wasn't popping. Yes.
So you kind of talked about entering a genre as a user, as a writer. But what about this? What you said about your reader of your original Vita made me think, what can we, as readers of genres, how can we learn about someone who's maybe a novice and sending us some, let's say, a resume?
I think
so
it's
approaching it from the more generous reading of a less experienced practitioner.
I think that's a great question, and one that I thought a lot about because I think about how it affects me in my life. And I think a lot of it has to do with a certain, I hope, generosity spirit. That is not to see the situation that I'm in as so closed off that I'm trying to keep others out of it, but instead seeing it as, what does this person bring, and what do I see that they're bringing with them and attempting to bring into this new situation? And I think not always in a way that I don't always have to think, oh, how will they change us, but how can I help them to shape what they bring that's unique for them? And I think that we have that. When I used a lot of examples from my grandchildren, because I think when we look at children's writing, we have that generosity. We're willing to say that's not really what a recipe looks like, Matthew, but I don't go to Matthew and say, well, you didn't write down measurements for or amounts for every one of these things. I still understood the intent. And I think that for me, what happened because of my experience and now as a teacher, what I turn around is trying to think, why does a person see this as appropriate for this setting? Why do they see this? And what does that suggest about their background? What feedback might I give to help them fit better? If that's what the question is, do they need to fit better? So for instance, if I'm having students who are writing proposals for conferences, and I'm trying to help them with that, I can't have the same kind of feeling as I have towards Matthew's recipe. I can't say, oh, this is cute and darling and I'm fine with it. I have to be able to help them, but I can say, okay, this is what you bring. Now, how do I help you shape that for what I know the readers are going to expect in that situation? And I think a lot of it has to do with just our positioning ourselves as not being exclusionary, and saying, oh, sorry, only the faculty get to go to conferences and we know how to write these things, but more like, oh, I hope you'll do this your whole career, so let's teach you how to write this now. I think that kind of generosity is at the heart of it, and just kind of being okay with smiling a little at a novice's attempt. So, I guess make us all into grandparents. What else? Yes.
Well, I like the point you make that there's social pressures, social factors. One factor for the genre is going to be social.
Yes.
You alluded to the idea, or I should say alluded, you did mention it, but you spent much more time on the social factors, that you have functional
Yes.
pressures as well. And
Yes.
it seems to me that those won't always, well, it seems to me they're going to be in tension more often than they're going to. Well, that's not so. You were giving us examples of where you have tension. For example, that was a very clever Christmas reading card, but if it had any functional value, people would keep doing it. It doesn't.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's a very useful genre for whatever it was.
Scholarly.
Yeah. Because you know where to look for the information right away.
Yes, yeah.
I don't know where the question is in here.
That's okay.
What is the relationship? How much have you thought about the relationship between? Well, I remember where the question was. The Pickleback Princess didn't seem to have any functional kind of. Once you moved away from formal features, is there anything functional that has to do with it?
Oh, well, I think there are, and it depends. I mean, all genres, and I had it up on the slide. I didn't talk about every aspect of genres, which is that they're cultural, they're ideological, they're rhetorical. They are. I talked mostly about their social features, but all of those other things are embedded in them, and probably the wedding announcements, or maybe when I mentioned the language, and that gets at a little bit of ideology and culture as well. But I think fairy tales, are incredibly ideological in the sense that they position the children, who are their primary audience, for certain belief systems. And so I think that what that one was doing in what I would consider a clever way is kind of pushing against, not just, it was using the structure, okay, the formal structures of a fairy tale, but pushing against some of the cultural and ideological norms that we normally expect from that genre, and pushing against it enough that I think sometimes it might have a function in terms of shaping culture. That book is about 30 years old now, and I think if we think about its placement in history, genres are historical too, so where they have histories and where they come out. So I think where it came out in history was pushing against some of the other aspects of it. The function then becomes its use in that social situation and in a cultural spot in time. And so I think you're right in the sense that would everybody make good use of using a scholarly article for a Christmas letter? No, because the function of those formal features is really useful for scholars. But it's not so useful for that. But it was clever for that point in time for them. It was clever for that. But I think in the fairy tale, for instance, that has a lot more ideological implications that I think play off the function of the story. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So how do you mark the boundary between effective use of genre and the problem of cliche? Because if somebody just wrote trying to repeat the genre, they might have that issue, right?
Okay, in this sense that I think I talked about approximation, and I think when you are coming into a genre, it's mostly going to be cliche at the first stages, because I think you don't understand all the nuances of it. So it's going to be a replication of the formal features with a few of the other aspects of it. So I think that there's a little chance to avoid it. And some of us who are English faculty in here, when students write literary analysis essays, you know, when it's not the genre that they live in and that they're immersed in, their initial attempts are often kind of formulaic and cliche because they're beginners. And so they're appropriating and they're taking the ones that they're able to understand at that point. So there's going to be an element of it always in the approximation stage and probably early acquisition. Yeah, Kristen.
I've been sitting here thinking about the relationship between genre and power, right? In many ways, genre is about power, right?
It is,
Both its designation and maintenance.
Yes.
And so sometimes when students ask, well, why do I have to learn how to write in this way? I say, well, it gives you access to this particular community of power. But it also reaffirms the power.
It does, until, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm curious, in your teaching of genre and the teaching of writing, how you frame that and how you frame particular ways of resisting that kind of reaffirmation of the power.
Well, I think there are two things. One has to do with first getting into it. So sometimes to join the group, you have to play the game. You have to be able. So I think there's that. And then once you're in a position inside the group, you can affect more changes. But I think a key factor really is those elements of flexibility that every genre has, and figuring out, I think really smart people figure out how to use what can be flexed by the users of the genre, even if you aren't in a position of power. You can figure out how to use aspects of that genre to accomplish your own ends. And I think the wedding announcements are an interesting example, because there's not really a person of power except the cultural expectations, right? But once you start seeing people kind of move against that and start saying, well, wait, you know, we're the central people, we're going to put us center on this announcement, then you start seeing them push against the power structures that the culture places around that event in our lives. So I think there are two, and one is probably at first you have to know the genre well enough to know how to get in and move it around, and that's probably where people like you know, once you've joined and you figured out how everybody talks in this group, then you can start pushing at some of those areas that we feel uncomfortable about or we want to change the power structure. And I think that's where that happens best. I think if we jump in too early trying to change, the structures often work against us. So I think getting to know it well enough to figure out how to use those little inside pieces is probably the most important part. But I think a second part has to be that you recognize how it positions you. And lots of users of genres do not know how they are positioned by the genres that they use every day. They do not understand it at all. So just being sensitized to that is a big part of it. I think Mary would be asked maybe 1 minute.
Well, you may have answered the question I have, but we tend to really celebrate people who destroy genres or create new genres wholesale, and we tend to teach them. And so your examples were people who maybe unknowingly bump up against and bruise themselves on the genre, but what about the students who think, well, I'm the genius, and I am going to be the one who sees this, but you're holding up to me all these examples of people throughout history who've done something totally new, and I'm that person.
That's a great question, and maybe they are, and maybe they'll be beat down too. You know, what makes the difference? There is some sort of creative genius that allows some people, and I actually think that it's not necessarily, how can I say this? It's not necessarily a genius of IQ kind of genius, more a social genius. In other words, in understanding how they can work against it without being killed by the powers that control the genre. Does that make sense? So it's a kind of social genius that allows them to push, and know, and it's just enough, not too much, and when they can push against, and the people who have power can't do anything about it. So, a different kind of genius. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dean, and, well, thank you for attending.